It has been so long since I have written any kind of blog post or made any kind of video or media or really much content outside of posting here and there. And I'm just now in my period of defrosting. Winter is usually a period of deep retreat for me. At this point, it's embedded into my workflow because I used to deal with seasonal depression really bad. And so I just honor that instead of fighting it. And so winter is always a time where I go inward, I reflect, I stop producing, I reconnect with myself. And this year I emerged just a little bit later than I usually do because I wasn't fully ready to come out of the shadows until now. But I do typically defrost around my birthday, around March, even across the world, or feeling the literal cold of winter this year. I still felt the need to go inward. And my birthday falls right around the transition into spring. So it's always like this ceremonial resurrection back to life around my birthday. So for those of you who do not know, I turned 29 last week. I am officially in the last year of my 20s. Wow. It feels amazing. But astrologically, right, your solar return is your birthday, give or take a few days, right? Depending on what the actual moment was when the sun returned to the exact position it was in when you were born. So it's almost like this reset or this recalibration. Your vitality comes back because the sun is literally charged up by your natal sun. So this year, my solar return chart has a Virgo rising, which is the same as my natal chart. And that is such a deep confirmation of what I've been feeling these past few weeks or a few months, really, just this homecoming that has been brewing. This feels like the year that I stop exploring just for exploration's sake and really just start to inhabit and embody who I am and who I have always been. And it's also my Saturn return year. Y'all know 29 is when you experience your Saturn return. But if you're not familiar, Saturn completes its first full orbit back to its natal position around age 29. And most astrologers will call this the initiation into adulthood. Most people experience their Saturn return as like this hard period of their lives where structures fall apart and their identities kind of dissolve. And it's almost like this gap between who you've been performing and who you actually are. And it almost becomes impossible to ignore around this time. Now, Saturn actually dipped into Aries briefly last summer before returning to Pisces, and I got a little bit of a taste of what was coming. This period was really confronting for me, but it also asked me very directly, like, do you really want to do this? These things that you're pursuing, do you really think this is what you're supposed to be doing? And now, for me, now that it's here to stay, it definitely feels like this release of pressure. It feels like this release of pressure. And I think that's because, the Saturn return for most people is about unlearning other people's limitations and shedding these frameworks that were placed on them without consent. It's from other people, it's from peers, it's from family, it's from culture, it's from society. But the limitations I've been working through have always been my own. Nobody else really put them there. And I'm really realizing that. I'm really realizing what it looks like to break free from my own self-imposed limitations and really step fully into myself. Now, I've been through a lot of things since that dip last summer. So I left the country. I closed my spiritual store that I've had for 6 years that I literally started from scratch from $0. I stopped offering readings. I finally published or started publishing the plethora of books that I have in my brain, in my notes, in my journals. I had a mentor situation that didn't go the way that I thought that it would, which I'll probably either write about separately or talk about separately because I do think it deserves its own space in its own unpacking. But throughout all of that, one thing has been consistent and constant. I keep returning to myself. Sometimes I'll literally go through old content of mine and just be like, bro, I have always had it. I had it. I've always had it. And I started questioning who I am or whether I was on the right track, when I let other people get in my head, when I start comparing myself to where other people were or are, or what my life is supposed to look like by now. And every single time, my clarity returns the moment I stop listening to all of that noise. I'm really somebody that needs to be alone. Like, I'm really somebody that thrives in solitude. And with that, with sitting all of that, reflecting on all of that, as I am embracing this 29th year of my life, I keep landing on this same word, freedom. And specifically, how freedom has been the greatest gift I have ever been given, and how also for the majority of my life, it was the heaviest thing I have been carrying. Now, I don't have a deconstruction story. I have always been encouraged to be my own person in every capacity, whether that be creatively, career-wise, spiritually. I was never forced into a box. And because of that, as someone who literally writes about God and religion and spiritual philosophy for a living, I am probably one of the only people in this space who doesn't have a deconstruction story. The deconstruction narrative is literally everywhere right now. I mean, you can't escape it. Every time you think that you're coming across information that is objective, it always has like a little bit of church hurt within it. This whole like, I left Christianity because it doesn't make sense, and da 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 da, and it's slavery, is the slave man's religion. Oh, it's this process of dismantling a framework that was placed on you without your consent and trying to find yourself underneath all of it. And I get it. I get tagged in content like this all the time. People looking for my perspective or looking for the language to interact with this way of being. And it's very real and it's valid, and I empathize deeply, but it's just not my story. I've never been indoctrinated into anything. My mom is a proud Aquarius, and if you know, you know. She raised me with an unusual amount of freedom. I didn't have a religion I was required to follow. I didn't have a career path that was expected of me, no particular lifestyle that she was steering me toward. She always told me, when you're at school, when you're out in the world, you do what you have to do to thrive. You pay attention, you be respectful, you get your grades. But when you come home, make sure you come back to yourself. Don't lose your creativity, don't lose your curiosity, and find God on your own terms. I'm also a child of immigrants. My father and my stepfather were both immigrants from different countries, different religions. I grew up around people from all over the world, okay? Different belief systems, different cultures, different ways of moving through the world. My bloodline literally has global roots, and I was always encouraged to embrace all of it. I was raised with the Bible, the Quran, incense, ancestral veneration, crystals, scripture. Oh my gosh, all of the things. Feng shui. I'm just trying to think of all of the things my mom just like always did growing up. It was never like it was just always a global phenomenon going on in my house. It was like a conglomerate of everything from all around the world that occurred in my household. So, there was never a container I was trying to escape or a doctrine I was recovering from. There wasn't a version of God I was handed that I'm now trying to unlearn. So I think honestly what I had instead was probably harder. I had to build from scratch. And a lot of times when people interact with me, they express a kind of envy almost for the freedom I was given. And I get it. It sounds like a dream. There's no rules, no box, no permission, or full permission, total permission to become whoever you are. But for me, that actually caused a lot of mental strife. Most people's moral compass is built on religion. Even people who don't actively practice religion, culturally, loosely, there's always some kind of baseline. God exists, be a good person, here's where the lines are. When you grow up inside of tradition, morality is pretty much defined for you. You know the rules, even if you chose to break them. When you grow up outside of those lines, you have to draw them yourself. I went through a lot of my life feeling like I was just kind of expected to know things. I was expected to know certain behaviors or what was socially acceptable and how to fit in. And because the values I was raised with differed so deeply from the norm, I was often the person who could speak everyone else's language, but nobody could really speak mine. I could get along with people on a surface level, but real depth and understanding always required some version of masking. I was always a little bit of a disruption in the rooms that I walked into. And obviously, it wasn't something that I was consciously trying to do, but I couldn't be put into a box. It was impossible. And people who can't be put into a box make other people uncomfortable. I was obsessed with being a good person, a godly person. I wanted to live up to some kind of standard. I just didn't know whose standard to live up to. I didn't have a book telling me. I didn't have, a doctrine, a tradition to tell me what a godly person or a good person looked like. So I did what any deeply curious kid would do. I tried everything. And people always talk about how wise I am, but they have no idea the turmoil that came with it from the inside. It often felt like being dropped in the middle of the ocean and told the shore was out there somewhere. You'll find it. I trust you. But without that internal framework that I could trust, I was just absorbing other people's projections of me. I became whatever room I walked into. I wouldn't call myself fake necessarily, but I didn't have anything solid enough to push back against the pressure. I remember asking a friend once, how do I stop caring what people think about me when I have to rely on people liking me? I never had a real job. That's another thing, like I always followed passions and made money from them because that's how, my mom always encouraged that. That's another form of freedom my mom gave me. So I felt like I had to rely on people liking me to make money. And so people's perception of me wasn't always like this abstract thing that I could just ignore. It felt like survival for me. And he always told me, you know, this friend, he always told me, if you're not rooted in your own morality, you will always be in a tailspin. And he was so right. Every opinion felt like gravity to me. All of this criticism, it felt like it might be true. I had no way to decide for myself what was actually real versus what was being projected onto me. There were years where I genuinely just didn't have a will to live. I've had a relatively good life on the outside, but there was definitely an emptiness I couldn't locate the source of. I felt like I was mostly just existing and floating, like the world would be fine without my interference or triggering people's cognitive dissonance, challenging their comfort or disrupting the flow. I literally felt like a disruption. I felt like the world was just something that was already operating in the way that it needed to. And here I come, this weird girl who is like so religiously and culturally fluent and challenging other people's perceptions of reality. And I now understand that as a sign that I was way ahead of my time and way ahead of where my environment actually was. But for most of my life, it felt like a curse. But ironically, the places where I felt the most grounded were religious communities. I remember getting ready with a group of Hebrew Israelite women. This was during my Hebrew Israelite era before a wedding. We were laying each other's edges. We were wrapping our hair. We made sure we were modest, but still fly, laughing, doing girl talk. And there was something so warm about this structure, this shared language and sisterhood, this sense of belonging inside of a container that everyone agreed on. I was cosplaying at this point, if I'm honest. I knew I was there out of curiosity, but it was easy to play the character because I genuinely enjoyed it. Some of the best relationships I've had with other women have been inside of the confines of a religious space. And as amazing as my mother was, I never really got along with women too much, which is also a form of a mother wound that I'll probably write about separately. But as someone who never had a container of my own, I just felt that warmth of dedication, certainty, that sisterhood. I just wanted somebody to tell me what was true because I had some amazing communal experiences within religious containers. But it's just something about this whole religious thing that my logical brain just couldn't fathom committing to something I couldn't prove. I couldn't fully commit to any single tradition because they all made sense to me. Every last one made sense to me. And that was its own kind of torment, not being able to pick, not necessarily because I was flighty, but because I genuinely could see the validity in all of them, and I couldn't figure out how they could all be right at the same time. But what eventually clicked was that they all made sense because none of them were wrong. They were just different cultural representations of God, shaped by the land, the people, the history, the needs of a particular time and place. They were different dialects for the same source language. Astrology was the thing that gave me that map. My mom had always been into it, like deeply into it, and honestly, it got on my nerves for a long time. Like I would try to have a conversation with her, and she'd bring up her Mars in the eighth house. Like, girl, I do not give a listen. I do not care about your Mars in the eighth house. But eventually, I got into it myself, and I'm glad that I did because it showed me the depth of what God could actually be. This was the first time God looked like me. It showed me God as light through a prism almost. Like that light is funneled through different cultures and traditions and cosmologies, producing the full spectrum. It's like every color was a different way of perceiving it, interacting with the same source. You have some religions that are more solar, some that are more lunar, some that are deeply Saturnian. Some have an entire pantheon that map almost perfectly along with the planets. It wasn't contradiction that I was seeing all along, it was translation, and astrology gave me the logic to inform the faith, which is exactly what my brain needed. Now, to know me is to know that Avatar: The Last Airbender is my favorite show to ever exist, and I rewatch it at least twice a year, so I'm going to make an Avatar reference here because, of course. So there's a moment in the show where Uncle Iroh explains how he learned to redirect lightning by studying waterbenders. And he didn't abandon firebending. He literally couldn't. It would be against his nature to abandon firebending. He's a firebender. But he did understand the underlying principle well enough to pull wisdom from another tradition and integrate it into his own. And by the end of the series, you see it everywhere. You see Zuko firebending with earthbending and airbending techniques in his Agni Kai with Azula, which really only made him stronger. He wasn't copying them, but he was expanding and respecting these techniques. And this is exactly how I move through religious traditions. I don't have to like take on other people's gods to learn from their relationship with the divine. I can be deeply moved by Islam's devotion to daily prayer without being Muslim. I can be moved by Christianity's covenant theology without being Christian. I study the Quran and the Bible the same way I study any sacred text for context, for cultural understanding, for the version of God that people were reaching toward in that time and place. They're not rule books for me. They're just documents. So I didn't have to unlearn a lot of things. I didn't have to unlearn that astrology was evil. I didn't have an identity crisis around loving the occult and also believing in God. I didn't spend years fighting between what I'm drawn to and what some tradition told me I was supposed to be. I just didn't have that programming to begin with. And I think that's the beautiful thing about being raised without indoctrination. You can kind of look at all these systems without defending any of them or without being offended by any of them. You can see the pattern underneath without being loyal to any particular dialect. It doesn't become a sensitive topic that disrupts your whole sense of self. It's just information. It's just another color in the spectrum. I can speak the language of whoever I'm speaking to, and I think that in itself is an expression of love, which to me is an expression of God. I think we can all agree on God being the highest expression of love, or what God should be, I should say. And none of this is in spite of my upbringing, but it's because of it. It's because it was so unconventional. It's because of that I can speak the language of whoever I'm speaking to in that way and express love in that way. Now, the hard part about building a faith or anything really from scratch is that when you don't have this external authority, you can't blame anyone else for your beliefs. There's no priest, there's no pastor, there's no doctrine, there's no holy book you were handed at 7 years old. Everything else you believe, everything that you do believe is yours. And that means every decision you make from those beliefs is also yours. So there's no tradition to hide behind. There's no cultural script that excuses you from actually having to choose or actually having to create a world for yourself. That responsibility is heavy as fuck, especially when you're young and you don't have the self-knowledge to be responsible with the freedom. I had access to an ocean before I even knew how to swim. And for a long time, that looked like floating and absorbing other people and becoming a reflection of whatever room I walked into. But what eventually changed wasn't one moment, it was accumulation. It was trial and error across careers, relationships, belief systems, places, versions of myself. Everything that I tried, I was good at, which actually made it harder because honestly, nothing ever forced me out through failure. I had to choose to leave things behind. I had to choose to move on, choose again and again to follow the thing that kept pulling me back no matter how many detours I took. And what kept pulling me back every single time was studying and writing, creating, finding the God beneath all things, understanding how people perceive and express their own divinity, and letting that inform how I express mine. And I've tried enough now to know that this isn't a phase. This is the foundation. It is exactly what keeps me going. Now, most people spend the first 29 years inside of a container building their identity around a tradition, a family expectation, a career, a cultural script, and then they hit their Saturn return and they realize they have to excavate who they actually are underneath all of this. And they start the excavation at 29. I did mine at 10, at 12, at 15, at 19, at 22. I've been in the excavation my entire life, which means my Saturn return doesn't necessarily feel like a dismantling. It more so feels like this moment that I finally get to build, but not just build, expand on my own terms. I used to really get offended when people called me a free spirit or a jack of all trades because I think, do you just think I have no depth or no real direction, no real commitment to anything? Which would make me sometimes stay in things longer than I wanted to just to prove I could stick to something, just to prove that I can be taken seriously and that I take things seriously. And, looking back, that was probably more of my own perception than anyone was actually saying, but that's how I took it. But I understand things differently now. I understand that my freedom wasn't aimlessness. I was researching. It was simply research. Every tradition that I sat inside or a career that I tried, every community I moved through was just me building the database. It's accumulating the experience that I'd eventually need to write what I'm writing now. And now fully stepping into 29, into the last year of my 20s, my Saturn return, I don't have to tear anything down. I'm not unlearning. I'm not in recovery from anything anyone else put on me. I am building intentionally from knowing and from experience. And that is a completely different feeling. And honestly, I wish I could go back and tell the version of me that was floating and absorbing projections and wondering what the point of any of this was, that the freedom was going to make sense eventually. That building your own container is harder than inheriting one, but what you build fits differently because it fits you. I wish someone had told me that, when I was a kid in the anguish of not knowing what to believe, to just build my own religion, not just have my own relationship with God, but actually construct the whole thing and write it down and document it and make it yours. And that has been what the Sacred Source Code series is for me, the theology that I built from scratch, documented so that someone else doesn't have to feel alone in their building of theirs. Because the way that I believe we can weave a fragmented God back into its whole is by each person having the courage to document their fragment of God. The freedom my mother gave me wasn't the abandonment I felt it was for so long. It was a head start. And I just needed 29 years to understand that. I'm Mikayla Rose, and this is Glitch, the podcast. Until next time.